Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We have an update on the CCP virus outbreak, or at least in America. America has hit yet another record with their uncontrolled spread of the virus. Unfortunately, they've now surpassed 4 million cases. That is 1 million more than they had just 2 weeks ago. The increase is almost exponential at this point, although realistically, they will eventually achieve a cap, but over 1% of the US population has now been infected. To give some context, it took 99 days to reach the first million, 43 days for 2 million, 28 days for 3 million. It has taken 14 days for the next million. At this rate, we might see 5 million infections occur in the next week, and at that rate, America might be infected in its entirety by the end of the year, if not that much sooner. It's hopeful that the vaccines currently in development might be able to curb this growth. Currently, 3 companies have at least achieved major milestones in the development of their vaccines. This includes AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna. All 3 have completed early stage and then later stage human clinical trials, looking to go on to stage 3. Each of these vaccines has its strengths and weaknesses, and each of the studies and the way they've evaluated its efficacy has its strengths and weaknesses. One of the big catches is we don't know how effective it will be at preventing people from being infected. It may drastically reduce the severity and duration of the infection, much like the influenza vaccine does. While we're waiting on the vaccines to come out, there is another treatment that's thought it might reduce the number of patient deaths from the CCP virus. This comes from a small randomized trial of 100 patients who were given an aerosol formula of a protein called interferon beta. They had a significantly lower risk of developing severe symptoms when receiving this compared to the placebo. They were also far more likely to make a full recovery. The method behind it is simple. Interferon beta is suppressed by the CCP virus by artificially introducing more into the lungs where both the virus itself and the effects are most pronounced. They're able to mitigate and then overcome the effects of the CCP virus. By adding the extra interferon beta this way, they're able to rally the immune system and get it fighting against the CCP virus much more effectively than it could without. The advantages of the interferon beta versus other drugs that are being tested is that it is a relatively normal part of the body's function and should have minimal side effects. The questions will be about dosing, what time to use it, and exactly how to use it, but otherwise it should be safe and relatively effective compared to the other methods we're currently using. While looking at ways of treating it, we need to consider how to stop people from being infected, and a possible new N95 mask design that is both reusable and hygienic might be one of the ways to do this, assuming that people will actually use their masks. Not every mask is created the same, and you can imagine the difference between what can get through a high-quality mask versus a low-quality mask. There have been ongoing concerns about the quality of shipments received from China as far as the efficacy is concerned, and most countries have invested heavily in their own domestic manufacture to ensure quality. The masks that are mostly available tend to be single-use or disposable. That means you are buying them in a relatively large quantity to use for a short period and then replacing them. This is an added expense for people who are already unable to afford masks, and especially when we're talking about the health sector where their turnover is ridiculous, having something that could be reused and is hygienic would be ideal. It reduces the cost of care by a huge margin. That's where this new mask created by Harvard University and MIT comes in. The basic design is very much like an industrial respirator, It carries several cartridges that can be replaced as needed, but the bulk of the mask is a silicone-based design that fits around the nose and mouth tightly. This ensures that you only need to replace those filter cartridges, rather than the entire mask, as is the case with surgical masks. The creators of this new design think that the mask itself could be about $7 each, with each filter costing about 50 cents. This means one mask with 2 filters, which makes it functional, would cost about $8. That is significantly less than the cost of continuously replacing disposable masks. They are also able to be sterilized and reused, which means the cost remains low on a long-term basis. It ensures staff have access to their own equipment, which minimizes the chance of possibly spreading disease between them. The CDC has released new figures on just who is at risk of this spread, and that's an important thing to know about. There's been a lot of discussion in recent weeks about the possibility of reopening schools, criticisms of moving elderly people into nursing homes, into hospitals, about the risk for hospital staff, and so on. The CDC's data is important to understand just where we should be focusing our concern. Their conclusion is that those who are over 60 and with underlying health conditions should stock up on food, medicine, and avoid going out of their house in order to minimize their risk. They also believe that those who either have immunocompromised conditions, cancer, or chronic respiratory disease, all at high risk, along with high blood pressure. Their concern with this group versus the others is that they may develop severe symptoms of the CCP virus and then die. While we have the CDC giving out good, strong, reliable information, Instagram and particularly certain older influencers on there, mostly mothers, are spreading false information. Some of their false information focuses on the use of masks. Some of the more ridiculous arguments they make include that you can inhale micromold that can be trapped inside a mask, that there can be a slow buildup of CO2, and that children and toddlers are at risk when they can't get enough oxygen. They claim that they're seeing evidence of these events and that they want to let kids breathe. As you can imagine, they have no understanding of biology, chemistry, or the size of any of the things they're talking about. If they had even the slightest understanding, they would realize CO2 and O2, given the size of the molecule, easily pass through the mask's ventilation system. But, on the other side of the equation, mold can't get back in. This means it acts as an effective barrier, and it's one of the reasons why something like an N95 mask is in such high demand in medical circles and has been for years, given how well it works for its intended purpose. If not for this, we would have found that surgeons were dropping dead left, right, and center for decades, but they're not, and they haven't encountered this issue either. As terrifying as it is, this is practically an evolution of the anti-vaxxer rhetoric we have been seeing for years. It's the same fundamental arguments, the same fundamentally flawed logic, and same ignorance of science. We've previously mentioned that there are concerns about the CCP virus and children, but particularly older children. It was established early on that young children do not appear to either contract the CCP virus or transmit it as readily as adults did. This meant that it was thought that it would be safe to reopen schools and send children back. They should, at least in theory, not be able to spread the disease as effectively as adults would. What we're now seeing from studies based in South Korea is that it's possible that there is a tipping point when children do become more of a risk factor than a benefit. When we consider that many children have been sent back to high school with the intention of allowing them to complete their studies at an essential time in their education, this is an important thing to look at. It would appear that older children do spread the coronavirus at a similar level to what adults spread it with. The research comes from the Korean Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and they were looking at reports from the CCP virus spread from January 20th until March 27th. They used contact tracing of 5,706 patients who were identified as the center of clusters. These clusters led to 59,000 and a bit cases. By evaluating these cases, they found they were primarily based in households. Then they looked at the age distribution of these households, breaking the people into 10-year age brackets, being 0 to 9, 10 to 19, and so on, up to those who are over 80 years old. Within these various clusters of households, those with older children, particularly those between 10 and 19 years, had the highest rates of infection spread in household contacts. That is 18.6% of household contacts showing infection, nearly 20%. That's a big thing to be aware of when we're looking at the possibility of those who are under 10 years old only having 5.3% of household contacts spread. The researchers admit that there are limitations to this study, particularly that they're not entirely sure about their data set, but overall, it does match with some of the emerging data in other countries, and does demonstrate some concerns about school children. Knowing now from studies that are all about the CCP virus, there's a new blood test that could possibly identify a variety of types of cancer well before any of the current diagnostic techniques work. This is a relatively simple blood test that's been shown to work for various types of cancer that then allow them to identify with 91% accuracy with people who had no obvious symptoms. This means that in the possibly up to 4 or 5 years before stomach, esophageal, colon, lung, or liver cancer shows up, they might be able to tell you about this and allow you to take action to try and minimize the risk of it growing, deal with it while it's still manageable, or at least be able to take action that would minimize the significant impact it has on your life. The study itself should be taken with a grain of salt, or perhaps considerably more than just a grain. More than half of the authors work for a company responsible for creating the test, and therefore have a significant conflict of interest, if nothing else. If it is successful, though, the benefits are huge. Cancer is the leading cause of death worldwide, and it would be a significant improvement over our current methods of managing cancer once it's apparent. While talking about testing, we should mention a study looking at Neanderthal genes that could make some people more aware of pain. As you can imagine, Neanderthals have died out. It's thought that humans either interbred with them and bred them out of existence, or we outcompeted them. In either cases, it seems that for some reason, quite a few people still carry Neanderthal genes to an extensive degree. The evolution of this and the role it plays in our own life varies based on what we've seen. The nature of the DNA inherited from the Neanderthals varies, as we mentioned, but at least one of these is involved in the movement of nerve impulses. In this case, sensory nerves. The more prone they are to activating, the more likely you are to feel a sensation. This includes pain. A small fraction of British people have a mutated version of this, and that does make them feel the sensation of pain more acutely than those without the mutated version. What is really interesting is how this particular study has elucidated and demonstrated how small changes in the genome can have huge ramifications. In particular, this version of the gene alters 3 amino acids. This then alters the sequence of the protein and has the effect that we've mentioned, greater sensation of pain. If it had been just a single amino acid being replaced, it's thought that this particular phenomenon would not be observed, but together the 3 have the effect that we're seeing, and it explains and demonstrates just how small changes can have big ramifications. While talking about interesting things, we should speak about the Salmonella study. Salmonella has been one of the long-term problems. We've mentioned it before when it comes to food safety, and one of the things we mentioned at the time was to ensure that you washed your hands and other things properly to remove the Salmonella. Well, that advice might be a problem, with a new study showing that Salmonella has found a way to better adhere to food. This means washing it off is not as easy. The Salmonella in this case works by getting access to the stomata. These are small openings that will close and open as needed on the leaf surfaces of things like spinach and lettuce. It allows the plant to cool off. Some other pathogens will attack these and brute force their way through. This allows the pathogen to get into the plant. Now, we don't normally see this with Salmonella. In fact, more often than not, it's plant-based pathogens. The fact that a human pathogen can now do it means it's jumping across its skill sets. And that's a problem, as it means we need to be wary of our food safety again. And food safety means that if you were to eat this and the Salmonella were present, there's a good chance that the human infection routine might start over. Salmonella works by getting into our GI tract from our mouth, going down and through the digestive system and coming out the other end, where it then gets in contact with, say, your hands, cooking surfaces, and so on, where it then comes into contact with your mouth once more and repeats the cycle. In this case, it doesn't need to repeat the cycle in order to start it off, because all it has to do is be in your food. Still focusing on environmental concerns, the 2020 Apocalypse Bingo card has had another box crossed off. In this case, a river of black sludge in Arizona. And yes, the video is real. It's interesting in just what it is and what it's showing you. Particularly, the contents of this are all coming from a fire that's been raging over there since the start of July. Fundamentally, what happens is the fire goes through and burns everything, creating charcoal, ash, and soot. The soil itself is heated to a point where it mineralizes, and this releases content and prevents the ground from soaking up water. Ultimately, the water goes into these waterways and carries it downstream, which is what we're seeing here. It's a combination of all the charcoal, soot, mineralized material, and more that the water is unable to penetrate into the ground and instead carried away like this. It's an interesting example of one of the effects of wildfires, particularly in America. While on the topic of mineralization and fertilization of the ground, there's been a slight development in the agricultural industrial sector. In particular, how a small modification and change to the fertilizing and watering routine for crops could increase CO2 absorption each year. This would help somewhat in our efforts to reduce and ultimately fight some of the global warming that we're seeing through CO2. The method is to add what is called crushed rock dust. This then creates a chemical reaction of its own, which binds with the CO2, which is brought down by rain. This then creates a bicarbonate product. This is locked into the soil, and this allows for the amount that's in the atmosphere to be reduced. The advantage of using the rock dust is that it increases the surface area relative to the volume. This means that it can more effectively bind with the CO2 in the atmosphere, or at least in the air, which is brought down by the rain, which increases its efficacy. Compared to the naturally occurring phenomena, it's far more efficient and far more effective. And it's thought that if we were to use this along with normal crop rotation and everything else, it would remove billions of tons of CO2 every year on a global scale. This is further benefited by the fact that we can recycle material from the mining industries and construction byproducts. Even with those considerations, the researchers were able to factor in the cost of moving the rock dust and the fact that it's already being utilized in similar elements for soil pH and prevent erosion. All over, it is a win-win scenario. The researchers think that if we were to use this method by 2050, we might be able to significantly reduce global greenhouse emissions, equivalent to both international shipping and the aerospace industry combined. Going from the Earth to space, the US Space Command has claimed it has evidence that Russia is testing a non-destructive space-based anti-satellite weapon. The concern here is much like China, who recently launched an anti-satellite weapon of their own from Earth. It could lead to a number of issues. First, and perhaps foremost, is the risk to communication satellites and the US military ability to both observe foreign countries and to provide its own logistical support to the military. Then we need to consider that if they were to destroy these satellites in space, there's a risk for the ISS, other satellites such as communication satellites, and deployment of new resources who could all run into the fallout and debris from these destroyed satellites. Then there's the effect that these might have on our ability to look into space. All of this debris would interfere with the ground-based radars we use quite frequently. It could also damage the existing telescopes that are in space. These telescopes that are in space are more important than ever when we look at one of the unexpected, or at least less advertised effects of the SpaceX satellite program. We've mentioned previously that SpaceX was deploying its own network of satellites with the intention of being able to provide internet to the world, along with other services. Well, one of the downsides we mentioned at the time was that with the sheer number of satellites they're looking to deploy, it could interfere with our ability to look into space, and that's now being demonstrated with a photo. The photo by Daniel Lopez, an astrophotographer, has shown exactly how all of these tiny satellites interfere with images being taken. The Starlink satellites have effectively ruined the image taken by him. The problem we have is simply this. They fly through the sky at a relatively high speed, and they create streaks. These streaks get in the way of photography, let alone anything else we're trying to do. For instance, radio telescope imaging. You can think of this as something similar to light pollution on Earth, but instead it's now space pollution, and especially relevant for the astronomy fields. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting or useful, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.